Welcome to the International Schools Podcast. I'm your co-host, John Mickton, and Dan is away this week. I'm really often when you are a classroom teacher and you are working in schools, there's a lot of pedagogic philosophies and approaches. Many of us are familiar with the MYP, PYP, and IB. There are also approaches of whole language, whole child. There's the inquiry model. There's visible thinking models. There's just a lot of different models that we engage with as educators in a way to really ensure that we're interacting and supporting students with the best pedagogy and best learning approaches to really support them when they walk away from a school setting and come into the real world. And one thing over the years that's become much more prominent is this idea of design thinking and the design thinking cycle. And that's the idea of this circle where you have many different stages where kids have agency and voice. And this is adopted in some places and not in others, but still we still have this exam-driven approach because at the end of the day, universities often want grades. A lot of schools and parents, they refer to their past, and the past is measured by their own experience, which might be exam-driven. But today I'm really excited to have John Miller from the Agile Classroom because this is a very different approach. And we're going to have the opportunity to look at how, as educators, when you're in a classroom, you can really approach learning and the way you collaborate and actually co-facilitate with students an opportunity for them to be engaged and really have that ownership. Because there's a lot of evidence in research, the more voice and choice students have, often the engagement level comes up. But of course, that has to be structured with frameworks, and there's a scope and sequence that we work with. Anyway, I'm excited to have John because he's going to talk about his organization and this approach. And also, we're going to kind of explore what does it mean in the working world and how do you transition or transfer some of that to the school environment and back and forth. So, John, welcome to the International School Podcast. It's a real privilege to have you here today.
Yeah, thank you, John, for having me.
So, John, maybe just give us a little context of who you are and a bit about your organization, and then we'll dive into some of the philosophies and approaches and kind of the pedagogy that you are working with not only schools, but also corporations.
Sure, John Miller with Agile Classrooms. And what we're there to do is very, very similar to what you're talking about is how do you, use the buzzwords, get future ready students, but how do you make it accessible to anybody, I think like design thinking is awesome, project-based learning, all amazing stuff. But yet, how do you operationalize future readiness, no matter what you do, no matter what you're learning, if it's PBL or if you're like, hey, I just got to teach math. And how do you embed these 21st century skills and integrate it all the way throughout, but also in a way that isn't, wasn't conjured out by an academic and nothing against that at all, but based on reality, based on, the way innovative companies work. If there are things that processes and the way they work that we can bring into the learning environment to where they're just authentically using those ways of working in the learning. So we try to merge those two together. Like how do you make it an authentic process, right? That can be applied to work or anything in life. But yet, how do we make sure we're helping, that's actually helping us to make those academic standards of mastery actually happen in the classroom where they're not divorced from each other, where people kind of play around sometimes. They're like, hey, we're going to do design thinking, which is awesome. But sometimes you're not getting in the standards you have to hit at the same time. So how do we bring those two together? And I would say that's the kind of the essence of Agile Classrooms is, authentic future readiness, but applied in the classroom setting, and you could learn anything with it.
So one thing that I'm hearing from the way you're sharing it is that there is that creative tension that a lot of pedagogic approaches and philosophies and frameworks are based on a lot of theory and research, and often translating them into a classroom setting be it whatever type of classroom, there's so many other variables that get in the way. You have 24 kids with different personalities. You have differentiated learning. You have students that maybe English or whatever is the native language that you're teaching is not their first language. So all these things come in. They're kind of what I would call shrapnel that flies around. And what I'm hearing is that you're trying to translate this into something that's very concrete and doable, and still being able to address some of the key things that you might have to do that are being pushed down from the top. How did you get into this? Did you have an education background? Was it through a personal experience that you saw this and you're like, this is not working for me, I need to come up with something?
No, no. I was actually an education technology director in a school district, and we were applying this thing called Agile, which is us. Again, it's kind of the way you see a lot of the modern companies, the way they're working. Very different from a traditional project-based learning almost, where you plan everything up front and then you execute the plan. Agile is about, hey, there's changes, there's complexity, there's a shrapnel, as you said, but not only in the classroom, but in the real world. There's all these variables that you can't predict, and you step into it and something changes, and how do you adapt to that change? So Agile is a way of working that focuses on small teams working in small iterations, right? So it's almost like little mini planning sessions, and they do it like almost like a mini project. And then you pause and reflect on it, say, how did that go? Anything that changed, anything we need to change? And then you go ahead and iterate again. So it's this iterative way of working where we develop things in small pieces all the way throughout. And every time we have a small piece, we can learn if it worked or not, and we adapt accordingly. So I was doing that in education technology, which was very different from the way the school district operated. If you've ever worked in the school district or school system, this idea of a self-organizing team where they self-manage themselves. I'm not telling them what to do. I'm like, here's the goal, and here's a way that you can figure that out on your own. Was very different. And teachers, as we worked with teachers in our projects, they would come to our offices or we go to them, and just what they would see around them. Like it was, people were in cubicles like you might see in these offices, or just an office. Like we were in teams, like the team sat together. They had very visible ways of tracking the project. You can't see it on the video, but on the audio, but like behind me, I have this, what we call I call a learning canvas, but a visible workflow. So everyone knows what's going on. They kind of had sticky notes, and they say, okay, this is what we're working on. This is what I'm working on with you. But anyway, teachers would come in and they were fascinated, like, wow. And they always say, this is what the future looks like. And some of them started to say, this is the way our classroom should look. And I was a little puzzled by that, because I was like, okay, what do you mean by this is the way classroom should look like? She goes, well, all the things that you're doing, like all these 21st century skills, I see it happening. Like they have ways of managing their own work. They have accountability, but they're self-directed, they're collaborative. Like these are the things that, we're trying to do with our students. So I was curious, but then teachers started to pull me in. I was like, hey, can you come to our classroom and maybe show us how to do it? I was like, all right, I can try. We'll see what happens. I don't know if it'll work, but sure. So if you're willing, I'm willing. And we kind of put peanut butter and chocolate together, the education and Agile world together, and see what happens. So I got pulled into it. It was never an aha moment for me or an idea I had. I got pulled into it, and it worked out pretty well. I was surprised, but we tried it in a few classrooms, and some things didn't work, obviously, that don't translate well to a classroom, but other things worked really well. So over the years, where it started to take off in some schools, I just kept working with teachers and coaching them on the Agile side, but they were coaching me on the teaching side, right? Like how to make this fit. So it was always a combination, and it merged to this thing that called Agile Classrooms now, that really is, I think, an authentic bridge between the classroom and the work world.
So what is so different from a classroom than, say, in a company? Because you refer to the Agile approach, which is very popular. You go to Forbes or any of these business magazines, it's kind of the buzzword, and all kinds of startups talk about it.
Yeah.
But what I'm hearing is that when you went into the classroom and you said you had to bridge the Agile with the classroom, what is it about a classroom that is maybe different, that requires a different approach with Agile?
Yeah, well, the first classrooms I started in was elementary school, primary. So in some ways that was a very good thing. In some ways better than high school because they're all together the whole time. And you can really make, sitting with a teacher who's doing this, you can really make it work. I think the difference between sometimes corporations and say high school or middle school is that you don't have a team together the whole time. Like in an organization, I'm working with a team for a year, right? And we're together the whole time. So that becomes a little bit tougher in some ways in the classroom where I'm only in the classroom for, hour and a half, 3 times a week. It becomes a little bit different. That's one small difference. I think the other big difference is that a lot of these kids don't have competencies yet. Where in an organization, a company, they've gone through college, they have certain hard and soft skills that they can bring together in what we call a cross-functional team. You have all the skills you need to build the thing. And in a classroom, they don't really have those cross-functional skills. And also with students, you can't expect them to be self-directed right off the bat. I think with adults, that's not always true, but there's a certain level of competency and maturity they have that you're like, okay, we're expecting you to be self-directed and we're expecting you to collaborate. And that's just the bare bones minimum of what you need to do. In a classroom, the kids haven't learned that. Often in traditional classrooms, they're sitting by themselves. They might do pair shares or some group work, but they really don't understand teamwork and how that works when we have shared ownership over the work and we're truly learning together. And they don't quite have the self-direction skills yet, right? Okay, how do I plan effectively? How do I monitor my own work effectively? How do I get help when I need it, right? But not too often, but when I need it. How do I review my work and how do I self-reflect to get better? They often don't have that. So in Agile Classrooms, what we do is we bring in the things from Agile, a lot of the similar processes, right? Like how do you plan? How do you check in to see where you are? But the difference here with the classroom is we scaffold it up, the self-direction. So in Agile Classrooms, there's a scaffolding model that we use and 2 types of scaffolding. Intentional scaffolding is we want you to become self-directed, but we know you might not be there yet, right? So if you start too soon with being self-directed, it can go to chaos. And they get overwhelmed. It's a cognitive load that you're placing on them. So we have a 5-step process to say, okay, maybe this is first where we start, and the teacher just shows you what to do. They'll what we call the learning routines. Here's how the teacher's planning, but she's sharing that with you. Here's how I'm planning our work. This is how I think through it, all the way to, in the end, maybe by the end of the year, possibly, they do it totally on their own. And the same with collaboration. There's a scaffolding pathway there too, because that's a skill set. You just don't throw people together and say, collaborate. There are certain skills you got to learn. And the same thing where some students will get overwhelmed or they get frustrated with collaboration. So we start out, okay, maybe you work by yourself and you use these processes, but as we grow, we want you to grow to where you can collaborate with anybody. So we also scaffold that throughout time as well in Agile Classrooms. And they're often not creating real products. So in the corporate world, you're creating things that are supposed to have customer value, business value. There's certain styles of learning, like project-based learning or things like that might apply. But often it's like my product is learning in the end. Like I need to learn something, not just produce something. So it's also the goals of what they're using it for is different. So we use similar processes that the corporate world uses in Agile, but we apply it for the focus. The core focus is how do you learn, and how do you become more self-directed, and how do you become more collaborative through the learning.
So what's really interesting, and I think this happens a lot from my experience, is that there are a lot of pedagogic approaches that are brought from what we'll call the real world or industry or whatever. And there's kind of everybody's in awe. Well, in industry, they do this so fast. It's amazing, these startups. But I think the point that you're bringing up that is really critical to understand is that scaffolding, because there is assumptions, and we really, as educators, understand or have to understand that with anything like that, everybody thinks kids can collaborate. Everybody thinks kids are self-directed. But in a class of 30 kids, guaranteed there are about 15, 18 different approaches to self-directions, many that are not going to be successful. So I think it's really interesting that you amplify and highlight this issue of really making sure you're scaffolding and making it doable in the sense that you break it down and take the time. And you talked about this timeline of a year or not. When you approach teachers or when you're working with teachers, this requires a lot of time and it requires a lot of thought and planning. How does that work for a teacher that might also have a test or a curriculum or a set of standards that they have to ensure they reach? How do you balance both? And what is your kind of pitch to teachers that are saying, this is great, but I just don't have the time to do it?
Well, I think you'll find that often with educators or really anybody. It isn't just an educator problem, by the way, being overburdened. And it's like anytime you change, it requires extra cognitive load. Anytime you make even simple changes, like you can't see it in the video, but if I ask people to cross their arms the regular way like this, like just cross your arms the normal way, people are pretty easy with it. But if I say, okay, now cross it the other way, and they start to fumble a little bit, like it's a little awkward. It's not hard, but it's not a habit. So even little changes can take a high cognitive load. And you do have to have reality that I have these real constraints. I would love to have a purely, free classroom and we do whatever we think is the right thing, but you often have real standards you have to hit. So I find that part isn't a big deal. Like if you need to do an exam. It doesn't change at all. It's just how do you get them ready for the exam is what's different, right? How do you get them, or as you go across the standards, you can plan those in actually much better with Agile, I find. You can bring those in to how you design that. And so you're going to hit these standards just like anything else. Another way of hitting it, though, I'm going to go a bit of a tangent, but another way of hitting standards isn't always intentionally planning them in. That's how we're programmed. There's another way, which is you catch them as they do them. So I'm talking about situations where they're doing more like project-based learning kind of activities, is that often as they do like real projects or authentic projects, they're doing a bunch of standards without you ever planning it. So what you can do there is say, okay, we break things into what we call sprints. And where if you take a project or learning, we don't say, here's the year-long project. We break that project into mini projects. We say, okay, you have a big thing, but we're going to break that. Imagine you have a mini project. You're going to deliver something, every 2 weeks, right? And it's going to be a real tangible thing you can see. And by doing that every 2 weeks or every week, however long the sprint length is, you can say, all right, what standards did you hit along the way? So there's actually one way is actually takes some burden off the teacher, right? From I don't have to know it all up front, and usually you hit a bunch of them. So that's one. The other one is, just like scaffolding we talked about with the kids, you can scaffold this in your classroom. It isn't about being perfect. It's about, was it Marshall Rosenberg once said, anything worth doing is worth doing poorly. And same thing here, like just get started. And one of the principles that we focus on is incremental work. So we break things into small pieces, and every teacher knows this, right? For learning, same thing with change. You break it into small pieces. So we have a way you can develop an Agile classroom. There's many ways to do it, but we say here's a default path that kind of works for a lot of people. And step one would be just make the learning visible. So we have visible tools that just makes learning really visible, and they can track their own progress. So maybe step one is just that. You're just making things visible, and they can track. You can see their work, and they can see their own work. Step two would be implement what we call a learning sprint, and you facilitate a learning sprint. And really, that's just a self-directed learning cycle. If you've done any self-directed learning or any kind, it's just a learning cycle in general. It's pretty much, all right, we have a planning session, what we call routines, because we believe you got to practice it to get better at it. So we have a planning routine, check-in, which is like a quick, almost formative assessment about how are you doing? Where's your progress? Do you need any help? Anything blocking you? Then there's a review where they show their work and they get feedback. It could be from peers or the teacher or themselves. And then there's what we call a retrospective, which is an intentional reflection at the end, not on the work, but on us as learners and our environment. So, okay, how do we collaborate this sprint? Oh, we didn't do so great. Oh, what do we need to do different next sprint? So you do a reflection, you find one improvement to apply in the next little cycle. So a learning sprint just repeats. It's just a cycle and it repeats itself. It's iterative. So you do that, every 2 weeks, whatever the length is. So one is facilitate those. But maybe you're doing that again at the beginning where they don't have a lot of self-direction, a lot of choice, but you're just modeling it as a teacher. Hey, we're going to do a thing called a sprint. Here's what we're doing. I find that the students like it because they have more clarity, even at that level of like, oh, I understand what's going on now, right? I'm not in the back seat. Like I'm actually on the passenger seat, at least with the teacher. And then from there, we scaffold that self-direction and we scaffold that collaboration accordingly. So, and that way you can build it incrementally. So visibility first, make things visible, implement the learning sprint routines, and then grow choice and grow collaboration. And sometimes, by the way, as you talked about scaffolding, sometimes as a scaffold, you have to go backwards. You might realize, whoa, I put way too much self-direction on you all, right? Like I thought we were ready, but maybe we're not. So let's bring it back down a step, right? And we got to find that zone of proximal development also with the skills, not just with the content.
Now, one thing that you're talking about is this idea also of going backwards and forwards and being, candid. And one thing that in the documentation, you have this kind of contract, and I think it's the wrong word, where there's this agreement between the teacher and the students. And the language is really interesting because it's very, how would I say, the playing field is kind of leveled in that agreement between the teacher and the students. Maybe you can talk a bit about that, because that's a very different approach, especially that for hundreds of years we've had teacher-centric. And I think, as teachers, and I'm very likely to lose a lot of listeners here, is that we like control. That's just a fact of being a teacher. And bless all the fantastic teachers. I'm not saying that control is bad, but and there's reason, because sometimes having control is a way to stop chaos and keep the ship going in a good direction. But sometimes letting go of that, and what you're proposing is very much kind of a flat leadership in the classroom. And if you can tell us a bit about that relationship.
Yeah, we call the thing you're referring to, we call the Learning Alliance, which is we're to create an alliance around learning. And we have, different stakeholders involved in the learning, which is whoever that is, teachers, students. And where I talked about the scaffolding, self-direction, collaboration, you apply it to everything. So even here in the Learning Alliance, you might say, you know what? I have more control right now. You have less control. And maybe that's the exact right thing to do, maybe at the beginning. So you might then create an agreement between the teacher, that maybe the teacher proposes the agreement. Here's what I think our agreement should start out with. So that would be one way of using that alliance. But you can go a little bit further out to where you have more voice, more choice of students, and you have them co-construct that. Or you go use it in a different way, which is for the student teams directly. So when we organize students into real teams, they have a contract with each other that says, how do we work? And the basic elements of that, that we have in our template anyway, is what do we value? What do we care about? So you come up with a couple of values that you care about, but then you tie those to behaviors. Right? You say, if we believed in openness, or if we believed in it's okay to be wrong, whatever the value is, this is what we will actually do in our behaviors daily to reinforce that value. So we believe in openness, then if someone comes in with an idea, we all listen, or something like that. So you actually have explicit behaviors that we follow. The other part of that is conflict. How do we deal with conflict? Because one, as we get more collaborative, you're going to have conflict, right? If anyone's ever had a family before, you love each other very much, you're together a lot, but with that togetherness, you're going to bump into each other and there's going to be conflict. So that's a 21st century skill that should probably be one of the 4 C's, is conflict mediation. How do you deal with conflict? And so we put that up front and say, okay, we know we're going to have conflict. How do we deal with it? Right. And we can go from some fancy research-based conflict protocols to simply kids writing, we talk it out, which surprisingly works really well. If they just say, if we have conflict, like, for example, there was one group of girls, their name was Team Bubblegum, and they got along really well. But one day I was there coaching and I saw something happening, and they pointed to their Learning Alliance. They pointed to it, and the 2 girls walked out front of the classroom in the hallway. And then they came back in, I don't know, 7 minutes later, and they got back to work and just were doing their stuff. And this was all without the teacher, right? And these were fourth graders, actually, so fourth grade. So I asked them afterwards. So I saw this happen. I saw you something looking like some kind of argument. Then you pointed at your learning your agreement, and then you walked out, came back in. What happened? And they looked at me puzzled, and they said, "Well, we had some argument. Can't remember what it was. Some conflict. So whatever. I can't remember. Ashley pointed and said, "Hey, our team agreement says we need to talk it out." Because that was their conflict protocol. We just talk it out. And so then I asked, "Well, what did you do?" And they looked at me like I was dumb. Like, "Well, we talked it out," like it said. So like, oh, it's that simple, right? It really can be just that simple. So those making it visible again and having it in their face the whole time, it reminds them when we get lost in the middle of things. Oh yeah, this is how we hold each other accountable. And that's another part of the agreement is accountability. Some people don't like that word accountability. So you might say, how do we reinforce our agreement with each other? And that's just, again, how do we do what I call redirecting or reaffirming. Reaffirming is like, oh, you were open. Hey, I want to give a shout out to you. That would be a way of holding accountability. It isn't all bad. Or it could be, you know what? If we don't follow our agreement, what do we do? So I have sometimes people have simple things as like they have an Elmo doll that they hold up. And it means if we ever get off topic and we lose focus, we hold up the Elmo doll. It means enough, let's move on. So that might be an accountability tool. I had one group of boys I had to coach out of this because I was a little concerned. It was a little too extreme. It was elementary school. And they said, okay, they devised this really complicated accountability system within, and it spread to other teams actually. They just organically spread. So, okay, well, they had 4 people on the team, and they said, okay, I'm the captain and he's the co-captain. I said, okay. I said, that's kind of not flat in my head but he's also the captain and she's also the co-captain. But so they're the captain of us and we're the captain of them. I was like, interested. Those kind of like they had accountability groups.
Yeah.
I said, okay, so what happens if you break a rule or something? So, well, we give them a warning. So they had this whole tier system, I think 4th or 5th grade. I said, first we give them a warning. And it was about focus was the big thing because they goofed off a bit. And so but they knew they needed to focus. So they created their own rules. It wasn't the teacher. It wasn't me. And I said, well, if we warn them, and then if they do it again, we have a captain's meeting, and then we'll get together and kind of warn them again, have a serious talk. Okay, then what happens? Well, 3rd try, then they get benched. Like, what do you mean they get benched? Well, they have to do a worksheet and they have to go to their desk and they can't work in our Agile team for the rest of the period. And I was like, okay. So, well, how's that when you get benched? They're like, oh, I don't like it. I don't like doing those worksheets. So it worked for them, but I felt it was a little extreme the whole period. I felt like it was a little too brutal. I was like, well, so my concern here is like a little too much. Like they're missing the whole thing. Could you do like maybe 15 minutes of worksheet or something? They're like, yeah, okay, we'll try that. But accountability was one. Just give you an example of how, if you look at a playground, the way kids play on a playground, they do that naturally. They come up with their own rules and they hold accountability, right? Oh, when we say freeze, they do it really well and they don't get in, too many arguments about it. So this is the same thing. It's just making it written and making it part of the learning. And then there's some other parts of it, but that's the basic gist, right?
And I think what's really interesting that, in describing this learning alliance is that, okay, you have this is how we're going to do things. This is how we're going to behave. But actually saying, what does it look like? Because so often you have class agreements and there's just the assumption that everybody understands what does it mean to be honest and trustworthy and not touch other people. And I think, so often in a journey of a student during the day, half the time they have no idea what's going on. I mean, they know that it's math or chemistry or whatever, language arts. But actually what I'm hearing and what I think really resonates for me is that visibility and constantly there, it's transparent, it's open. What have you noticed about kids that are coming into this Agile Classroom compared to kids that are not? Have you had the opportunity to kind of unpack some of these experiences with kids and what you're learning from this experience
Sure.
as
I
an
think,
organization?
well, one, I think you'll see the big theme, that visible classroom part, that's step one. So
Yeah.
having that transparency, and not just like, teachers love like having things on the walls, right? And there's some research saying maybe not so great, whatever. But it's like that, but it's actually directed to learning the things you're actually doing now, right? It's all about making that visible. Um, and I
So
find,
can I interrupt you, John? So you're saying the visibility that you have in the Agile Classroom model is that it's at the moment. You're visibly seeing where you are today at 10:35
yep,
and where you're going to go at
you'll
10:40.
see.
It's not like a review of, oh, this is the learning that we did on this unit, and we have a bunch of Post-its.
It's all those things. Is here's what we got done, and you can see that. So you can see it's like a progress bar. Imagine you had a video game, right? And it was in your classroom, and you had a progress bar about where everybody was, right? These, what we call the learning canvas. You'll see it behind me in the video. The learning canvas makes all that visible. So you'll see that you'll see some things in done. You'll see some things in progress they're doing, and you'll see here's what we need to do. So at any point in time, it's like a visible formative assessment, right? But empowering the students to see it at all times, and the teacher to see it. So everyone has transparency of this thing. And that helps a lot with building self-directedness, right? You need to have clarity about where you are, where you want to go, are you on track or you're not, and empower students with that right in front of their face, right? Just like a video game does. And that's why video games are so addicting, is you can see your progress all the way throughout. That's one of the reasons. So that's one. So I think that clarity that this provides, just step one, is empowering in itself. Once you have clarity, you reduce anxiety. And it's more than just putting a learning objective up on the wall, right? It's actually about also your learning process. How do we learn? And you'll see that these learning canvases will actually map out the process of our learning in columns. And the sticky notes, which is what are we learning, what are we doing, flows through that process. So that's no longer locked behind the teacher's head of how to learn. We projected that up on the wall. This is explicitly how we learn. Here are the steps of learning. And once you do that, they're actually learning how to learn. And learning is a verb. And that's the thing. It moves. It moves. And as you move these sticky notes along, you actually see learning in action, which is engaging ultimately. Just to see your progress, that feeling of moving something to done, you get a serotonin kick, and that creates engagement in itself. So I would say number one is just that level of clarity, the reduced anxiety. And with that level of clarity, even if you didn't give them much control yet, remember we talked about the scaffolding of self-direction, there's a feeling that I'm in more control of my
Because I have more
environment.
information.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
John Seeley Brown, the pedagogue and professor, always talks. He's done a lot of research on gaming, and he says the one thing that gamers like is they like to be measured. And I think we underestimate how kids like to be measured, not against another child, but measured against what am I doing? How am I doing it? Where I'm going? And I think these learning canvases that part of our audience can't see, which is behind you, is really so interesting because you have that, as you said, learning is a verb. So the Post-it is actually moving through that canvas. So kids actually see the progression and the building of that. Do you find that, you've been talking a lot about elementary school. Talk a bit about how this has happened in high schools. And we talked at the beginning about, it's a little different because, it's more modular. Kids go from one place to the other. But potentially the kids have more skills. They're coming to the
Right.
table with more, independence, more capacity to learn on their own. Talk a bit about what you've experienced with high schools and middle schools.
Well, working with Los Angeles Unified School District right now, they're doing project-based learning with it. Again, it depends on, that one's a little bit more complicated setup. They have they inject project-based learning, but they have their academic subjects. So their scheduling is pretty interesting how they have to schedule it. But there, I think you're right. They have higher level skills, so they're doing things like For example, they'll build a city, build a city project, but they're going through and not only using Agile for building it, but they're also using it to learn how to build it. Like, oh, how do I use SketchUp to do a design? How do I do 3D printing? So what they do is use Agile, but they go all the way through the project from I need to learn how to just draw, like what scaling is and how to draw it on paper, all the way to then maybe the next iteration is, okay, now we'll do it in 3D, 3D software like SketchUp, all the way to now we're going to learn 3D printing and take those concepts and apply it. So you're right. I think with high school, they're able to do a lot more with it, especially when you get into more like project-based learning. The challenges, though, with high school is that they've gone through often, and not every school is like this, because there's great things happening all over the place, but most cases they've gone through a system that's taught them to just listen, take the exam. So in some ways, it's harder than in elementary school, right? Elementary, they're much more open. They haven't been conditioned so far out. So I find it's actually easier in elementary school than often high school students because of this, because they've been tied to so much extrinsic motivators and how schooling works. So you kind of have to, in a way, have to decondition them.
Interesting.
And so I find it a little bit harder sometimes in high school, but it works really well too. I just find that's often a barrier at times. If they're used to school a certain way, and then you're introducing a whole different way, and that could be just like adults can be hard for them.
I think it's interesting what you're bringing up, because I think generally in primary and elementary schools, there tends to be more of an inquiry model, just the nature of a teacher teaching multiple subjects within the day. The day is quite fluid. While in a high school, middle school, you're literally going from one classroom to the other. There's a bell, there's kind of a structure, and that fluidity sometimes is much more difficult.
Yeah, the bell schedule with this model of Agile Classrooms, it can work, but I think it is an impediment though, because one teacher's doing it. They only get exposure to that, a couple hours a week. And it's really hard to develop true competencies. Like the things in Agile Classrooms is that, hey, you can use this for any content. You can use it for math, project-based learning. The process is the same. So by doing so, you're injecting 21st century skills and throughout all your learning, no matter what it is, if it's a subject-based course or project-based learning course. So that's really cool, but it takes practice. It's just like going to the gym. Like skills are different than knowledge, I think. I think skills takes lots of repetitions. Just like if you learn sport, music, whatever it might be, you got to get your reps in, and it's got to be frequent. It can't be every once in a while. It isn't like you just learned it and that's it. So the struggle I sometimes have with secondary is that one teacher will do it and they only get a brief exposure and don't really get enough reps in, like in elementary school, where if you have a teacher who's with those kids the whole time, at least in the US, that's the way it works. They're able to grow that. Maybe they start with one subject, but they're able to grow it, and those kids get really good at it. So by the end of the year, for example, and I've seen this in high school too. Again, these are just the impediments that are there in high school. In primary, I've seen by the end of the year where students were, one group of boys was sitting there, and we had one of these learning canvases, and they're sitting there, and it's just, they're doing nothing. Absolutely nothing at the beginning of the year. And I'm like, oh my God, I did a terrible thing to them. This is awful. They're going to fail, and all my trauma, catastrophizing was going through my head. And the teacher was like, no, they'll get it. They'll get it. Like she really had that growth mindset. And I was like, I don't know. But by the end of the year, that group of boys which was the one I was mostly worried about, were the most self-organized, self-managing group in the end, where the teacher came in and they said, okay, well, what's the lesson plan, right? What's the lesson plan for me? And it said, the kids will tell you what to do. And exactly what they did. Hey, here's a process. Every day we do this. And the sub was totally blown away. She said, I've never seen anything like that in my life. So that's where I do think I think often they're ready to be more self-directed, more collaborative, which is good. But also they have less often if you're just doing it one classroom at a time, they don't get as much practice at it, and it becomes a little bit tougher for it to really stick.
And I think that's so important, the idea of repetition and skills, because really it is, if you look at the different structures and frameworks, if you don't do it often, it doesn't become intrinsic. And you really
Right.
want it to become intrinsic, a bit like the two girls that went and talked it out. I mean,
Yeah.
they did not need anybody. It's intrinsically, they've been doing it enough, and they understood that Learning Alliance required them to do that. So I think that's just fascinating. What is the biggest resistance that you see? So, of course, you approach schools, schools approach you. I mean, have you ever had the situation where you're working with a school and you're like, you know what? This is not going to work here. I mean,
Oh yeah,
are,
for
are,
sure.
are you picky? I mean, is there like a audit that you do before you work with
I do.
schools?
I do a sense. I don't have like a a script, like an auto script, but there's certain things I try to find out. Usually, it's the intent, why they want to do it. And when I find it becomes just more about grades, I found like this wouldn't be the right thing. Like, yeah, you need to have good grades and all that. So make sure we don't ever jeopardize that. But there's a bigger intent here, which is the skills. Like, this really is a skills framework, right? How do you apply those skills? So one is why are they doing it? And if they're looking at just increasing proficiency in certain standards, my guess it wouldn't be the right fit. It wouldn't be enough motivation, right, to try to change. So that's one. Two is just really, I think it's the type of teacher. It's not really I think the type of school that supports it, obviously, but also when it comes to the teacher my persona here is the innovative teacher, the teacher who wants to innovate, and they've been looking for the how. Like, yeah, I've been trying this, but nothing quite, clicks. It's either it feels not authentic to the real world, or it just doesn't gel well, whatever it might be. They've been trying and it doesn't work out for them. So I find what Agile really attracts to is an innovative teacher who really wants to try something, play around with a new way. So one is there's got to be the spirit of innovation and the spirit of risk taking. I think if there's no risk taking and it's like, oh my God, if we fail in anything, and if it fails the first time, it's wrong. It's the wrong fit. And that's just not a 21st century skill anyway. I mean, we all know that, right? Like, you got to fail, you got to experiment, you got to try to learn. And three is just like, yeah, I'm willing to do this. Like, I'm willing because it does take time. I would love to say it doesn't. I would love to say, hey, just do it, and magically Chia Pet appears and it's just all amazing. No, anytime you change behavior, because the teacher has to change the way they teach, students have to change the way you think about you can use the same curriculum, but you have to structure it differently. So all that takes time, right? So if someone is feeling like really they are overwhelmed and they don't have an inch, I would say this could work for you. But if you don't have the time to put into it, if you're not willing to do that and invest that time, it's not going to work, and you'd be frustrated in the end. So I would say time, willingness, and that kind of spirit of innovation that has to be there.
And I think this is really important, because the other thing that you highlighted at the very beginning of our conversation was that anything which requires cognition change and behavior change is going to require an investment in time, and more than very likely the organization or the school community is willing. So there is kind of that personal intrinsic motivation that you have to engage with, saying this is going to make, and understand that it's a long-termism kind of, you have to really repeat and think of this over a year or maybe 2 years. And I think sometimes, when teachers are under a lot of pressure, or there's just a sense of kind of exhaustion, a quick fix is always pleasant to have. But I'm getting the real sense this is not about a quick fix. It's about really a culture and behavior change in the way you approach learning. And as we know, behavior is one of maybe the hardest things to change.
Yeah, you really need to want to change, I think, for this. The ones that are serious about it. And I mean, there are ways of bringing incrementally, getting quick wins, right? That we do. But to me, those quick wins aren't worth it if you're not in it for the long term, right? And you might get a lot of teachers will come in to find little tools or techniques that they can apply, and it's great. But if they're not really doing Agile, but they're doing pieces of it, and it helped them out, like the visibility tends to help a lot. So those things are great. But yeah, I think over the long term. But here's the thing: long term, it buys you time back.
And John, I'm happy you're saying that because so often, you think of the beginning of a school year. I've been very much involved with digital citizenship, and a lot of teachers just want to do 3 sessions and then it's done. But it's about where are you coming back and repeating? It's about a behavior, it's about a mindset. And I think that repetition and also understanding the investment that might take more time at the beginning, there's the payback at the end. And
Yeah.
I just really appreciate you highlighting that because so often I think people are feeling rushed and they're like, well, I
Yeah.
don't have time and I'm going to lose time.
The,
And
yeah.
actually,
The,
what I'm hearing is the opposite.
yeah. The pressures teachers are under today. I mean, it's ridiculous, right?
Yeah.
It's amazing. It's amazing they're able to even show up some days, I think. So I have a great empathy and huge amount of respect for what teachers do every single day. And often I remember being a technology director and it dawned on me. I was like, oh, I'm doing all these changes in technology to help make things better. And then, of course, it's happening. A lot of it's in the summertime. They come back. I'm like unveiling the beauty, what we think is great. And it dawned on me. I was like, yeah, I'm doing that. But HR is doing their thing. It goes to the teacher. Curriculum did their changes. Facilities did their changes about whatever all the stuff that changes, and it all hits them at the same time. So yeah, maybe I had stuff like, yeah, this isn't too much of a change, but you add up all the other changes that they had to hit on day one, they're drowning in change, right?
Yeah.
They're drowning in different changes. So, but hopefully the benefit of this is one, there's no like one right way of doing this. Like we provide some principles and some practices. Like, okay, do what you can, right? Same thing as your scaffolding. What can you do right now? And you get good at that and you build up, and that's going to buy you a little bit more time. But by the end, what you'll see is teachers would be able, Paul Magnuson in Switzerland, actually, John.
That's right. And Lausanne American School.
Yeah, Lausanne American School. Working with him, he had this cool idea of teacherless observation. And this really, I think, depicts what it can look like. The idea would be to really see if they're being self-directed and collaborative, this agile stuff. You should be able to go to a classroom, have the teacher go get coffee, and just observe, see what happens without the teacher there. So I love this concept that Paul came up with, the teacherless observation, because in the end, that's what happens if you stick with it. Is you don't have to be there. Right? I'm not saying the teacher just goes away, but now they're not doing all the classroom management stuff because the students have learned how to manage themselves better. And not saying you never need to do it, but you need to do a lot less of it. You don't need to be hand-holding every little thing, right? They learn how to learn. They're learning how to do it themselves. So now you're not the sage on the stage. There's still some times for lectures and mini lessons and all that. That stuff doesn't go away. But I'm much more freed up where I can do more of the things that teachers usually really want to do. Connect more with each student, really differentiate for them, really coach, right, along that. So it gives you all this time to do the stuff that I think most teachers find more fulfilling, and just time for you to use the bathroom, right? Oh, I can use the bathroom, and the classroom's going to and they're going to hold each other accountable while I'm gone. So I think the end result is you're going to get your time back, right, to do the things that you really want to do. But yeah, there is that investment up front, and there's going to be times where it didn't work out so well and you start doubting it. So that's where hopefully keeping the big picture in mind of like, what is your vision for your classroom, what is your vision for yourself, what do you want, and does your current state allow you to do that? If not, there's some changes that need to happen.
Yeah. Now, John, you have an organization. Are there a few of you educators? Tell us a bit about who's behind the curtain, kind of, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so Agile Classroom's just me, but I have other folks who help with the training, like Laura Williams, Jennifer Manley, and I have some others that will help coach and do training as well.
Great. And you've worked internationally and locally. What do you feel is maybe your biggest challenge when, we're talking about it being successful? What are some of the challenges that you've encountered and you're like, oh, shoot, I didn't think of that, or wow, that's interesting?
Well, it's the one is the framework I can say co-develop with teachers, because it's always evolving every time I work, is really a generic framework. So the idea is you can apply it to anything, but then, people want to know, how do I apply it specifically to math? Or, I don't have all those answers. It's not at the stage where we have a bunch of like extensions to it. This is here's how to do it here. So one is, how do you take something that's universal and make it very concrete and specific? The other, and that's kind of married to the other challenge I find with educate. I think this is, you said human, the teachers control. I think that's humans though. I don't think it's just a teacher thing. I think we all want to have control over our environment and reduce the feeling of uncertainty. I find the same thing though with this is that teachers say they want freedom. They want more flexibility, right? But then when you give them a kind of a framework, you say, okay, here's a framework that allows you to do what you want to do, right? But you need to adapt it. That means the work to adapt it is on you to figure out how to tweak it for you, how to make it work for you. It's not prescriptive. We give you some general patterns, some things to work with that work really well, but then from there you tweak it the way you want. And then they'll say, but I need to know exactly how to do it. So give me a script. So it's this weird situation where I think the toughest thing for me is, how do I keep it general enough to where it can adapt, where people have the flexibility, but also at the same time, how to make it concrete enough so people see how to actually do it without it being just another thing they have to comply to. So I find that's the toughest challenge, is finding the right balance between giving you the tool set to adapt it, but also, if you don't have all the time, tell you exactly what to do without killing the teacher's independence and creativity and how to apply it.
Yeah. John, I just want to tell our audience and listeners, John has put his bio, some resources, so definitely go to the show notes, and also social media connections, because I have gone to your site and seen you're extremely generous. I actually got to know John. I was doing a keynote in Vietnam at a tech conference, and I reached out to him because I was doing a thing about the adaptability quotient. And in a lot of the research I was doing, your work came up. So John, again, I want to thank you for being so generous and being able to use your resources and highlight some of the work that you've done. But I definitely encourage everybody to go to the show notes and go to the site. It's called Agile Classroom. And John has created PDFs, structures, frameworks that you can access. John, I want to say thank you. And is that generally your philosophy? You want people to be tapping into this? Of course, you have to generate an income, but you do make it very accessible for people.
Yeah. I want it to be a spirit of educators, I think, right? Is how do you make it impact? How do you use it? And where, I do need to make some money so I can fund these things. But that comes from more the training and the coaching, but the resources are always going to be free, always be available. If people want to use it, they're there for them. And in the end, the idea is to get teachers' time back, bring more sanity, but also get students to be future ready, which to me is that adaptability. And in the future, we can't predict the future. The whole idea of future readiness. All we can do is, how do we make sure students are adaptable to anything? And I think that's ultimately the goal of Agile Classrooms.
And in the keynote that I was doing about adaptability quotient, the only constant we have is change.
That's right.
And I think, as long as we're aware of that and we're setting up students to be able to work in that mindset and in that environment, I think, something like the Agile Classroom is a very powerful framework to really leverage that and give that skill set to students. John, thank you so much for your time and also sharing your insights and the way you work with school districts and teachers. This has been really a rich conversation. And again, I just want to remind people, go to the show notes, and it's agileclassroom.com. Am I correct?
Agileclassrooms.com, right? With the S.
Yeah, Agile Classrooms with the S.com. And John Miller, our guest, of course, is available. Reach out to him if this really excites you, and I'm sure he'll be happy to jump on a call with you. So thank you again, John, for the time and sharing your wisdom and expertise, and look forward to keeping in touch and connecting again soon.
Yeah, thank you, John. Thank you, listeners.